The year is 2477, and humanity, after centuries of quiet recovery and cautious expansion, had finally settled into a comfortable rhythm across 13 burgeoning star systems. Earth, once scarred and desolate, hummed with renewed life, a vibrant hub of innovation and culture. The United Terran Council, a body of elected representatives from every human-inhabited world, governed with a blend of technological prowess and hard-won wisdom, always remembering the fragility of their past. Life was good, if a little predictable. Then came the transmission. It wasn't a tentative probe, a faint whisper from the void, or a scientific curiosity. No, this was a galaxy-wide proclamation, booming and undeniable, emanating from a source light years away. It filled every communication channel, every public display, every personal comm unit with an overwhelming presence. The source identified itself as the glorious Xylosian Empire, and its message, flawlessly translated by humanity's advanced neural interfaces, was both grand and utterly bewildering. The proclamation detailed the Empire's vast dominion, a seemingly endless expanse of stars under its benevolent rule, a lineage stretching back tens of thousands of years. It spoke of order, stability, and an enlightened path for all burgeoning species. The core of their message, however, was simple and absolute. All nascent species were to submit peacefully, integrate into the imperial structure, and begin their journey towards enlightened subjugation. There was no room for negotiation, no hint of choice. Accompanying the deep, resonant voice were high-resolution images, crisp and terrifyingly real. They showed imperial battle fleets, impossibly vast constructs of gleaming, ornate metal, bristling with weaponry that defied human comprehension. These weren't just warships. They were mobile fortresses, entire cities capable of interstellar travel. Then came the Xylosian officials themselves. They were unlike anything humanity had ever conceptualized, towering beings with sleek chitinous exoskeletons that shimmered with metallic hues and multiple limbs, often 6 or more, moving with unsettling precision. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were stern, composed of complex sensory organs and unreadable expressions. They exuded an aura of ancient, unyielding authority. On Earth, within the hallowed advanced halls of the United Terran Council, the initial shock was palpable. A deep, unsettling silence descended as the final words of the proclamation faded, replaced by the faint hum of power conduits and the nervous coughs of the assembled delegates. Awe was the first emotion, a profound realization of just how small humanity truly was in the grand scheme of the cosmos. Then came trepidation, a cold knot of fear in the stomach of every leader. This was not a first contact. This was an ultimatum. Yet as the images of the Xylosian officials continued to cycle on the main holographic display, something strange began to happen. A small, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of Chairman Anya Sharma's mouth. A quiet snort from Representative Genly quickly stifled. A shared glance between Ambassador Kalen Reese and General Valerius Thorne, eyebrows subtly raised in unison. It started as a ripple, a barely contained giggle from a junior aide who quickly buried his face in his hands. Then it spread. A suppressed chuckle from a tech specialist in the back, followed by a cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Soon a wave of mirth, soft at first, then growing in intensity, began to sweep through the room. It wasn't a defiant roar or a nervous breakdown. It was a genuine, bubbling amusement that seemed to defy the gravity of the situation. Chairman Sharma, trying her best to maintain composure, found her own lips twitching, a smile threatening. To break through her practiced diplomatic facade, General Thorne, a man known for his unflappable demeanor, had to turn away from the main screen, his shoulders shaking slightly. The Xylosian Empire, with all its grandiosity and stern pronouncements, had somehow managed to strike a deeply absurd chord within the human psyche. The images of their intricate, overly serious battle formations, their rigid, almost theatrical poses, and the sheer, unblinking self-importance of their proclamation were just too much. Humanity, having faced down its own potential extinction, having rebuilt from the ashes, and having learned to laugh at its own follies, simply couldn't take the Xylosian Empire seriously. Not yet, anyway. The initial fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but for now it was overshadowed by a collective, barely contained wave of mirth that left the Terran Council utterly unprepared for what came next. The Xylosians were coming, and humanity was laughing. The question was, what would happen when the Empire found out? The suspense hung thick in the air, a peculiar blend of impending doom and the ridiculous. The initial, almost inappropriate laughter had subsided, replaced by a nervous energy that hummed through the United Terran Council chambers. The Xylosian Empire, seemingly oblivious to humanity's baffling reaction, swiftly followed their galactic proclamation with action. A few solar cycles later, sensors across the Sol system blared with new, more immediate alerts. An Imperial diplomatic vessel, identified as the Glory of Xylos Prime, entered human space. It was not a battle fleet, but its sheer size and pristine alien architecture commanded attention. The ship was a testament to a civilization beyond human comprehension, its surface rippling with intricate patterns and subtle lights, emitting a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Its arrival was heralded by a calculated display of power and ancient alien ritual, designed to impress and intimidate. Smaller, sleek Xylosian craft, like ceremonial escorts, spiraled around the Glory of Xylos Prime as it took up a high orbit above Earth. Holographic projections, broadcast directly from the Imperial vessel, displayed intricate, symbolic patterns and slow-moving, majestic figures, undoubtedly representing Xylosian history and might. The Terran Council, though still privately wrestling with suppressed amusement, understood the gravity of the situation. This was the moment of direct contact, the formal introduction of humanity to the wider galaxy, under the most unusual and unsettling of circumstances. They dispatched their most composed representatives, a hand-picked group chosen for their iron wills and their ability to maintain poker faces even in the most absurd situations. Among them were Chairman Anya Sharma, her face a mask of careful diplomacy, and Ambassador Kaylin Reese, whose reputation for unflappable calm was legendary. General Valerius Thorne, despite his previous display of amusement, was present, his military bearing impeccable, though a faint twinkle remained in his eyes. The rendezvous point was a specially constructed orbital diplomatic station, a neutral zone designed for first contacts. The Xylosian ambassador, a towering six-limbed being named Ambassador Exilar, materialized through a shimmering portal, accompanied by two equally imposing silent guards. Exilar's chitinous form gleamed under the station's lights, and his multiple limbs moved with a precise, almost robotic grace, his sensory organs positioned where a human's eyes would be fixed upon the Terran delegation with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like an unblinking assessment. Ambassador Exilar wasted no time on pleasantries. His voice, synthesized through the station's universal translator, was deep and resonant, devoid of any discernible emotion. He began his address not as an equal but as a superior, laying down immutable law. He spoke of the strict hierarchy of the Xylosian Empire, detailing the various castes and their roles, the intricate customs of obeisance required from newly integrated species, and the designated cultural re-education programs awaiting humanity. He explained how humanity would be gently guided towards true imperial efficiency, how their current chaotic systems would be replaced by orderly integration, all for their own good. He spoke of this with unwavering solemnity, his multi-jointed fingers occasionally gesturing in precise, almost mathematical patterns that were undoubtedly significant in Xylosian culture. He laid out charts and graphs projected holographically into the air, illustrating humanity's place within the vast imperial structure, a tiny, barely visible dot at the very bottom, destined for elevation through assimilation. The Terran delegation listened, an almost palpable tension in the room. Chairman Sharma maintained a polite, if somewhat strained, smile. Ambassador Reese's expression was carefully neutral. General Thorne stood rigidly at attention. They absorbed the words, the implications, the sheer audacity of a civilization so confidently dictating humanity's future. It was during a particularly dry exposition on resource allocation protocols that it happened. Junior Terran diplomat Ilara Vance, seated at a console, was attempting to discreetly check a data chip that had slipped from her pocket. As she fumbled, her elbow accidentally brushed against the side of a small, personal holographic projector she had forgotten was active on her desk. With a sudden flicker, a new image burst forth, unexpectedly large, filling a significant portion of the air between the delegations. It was an ancient human meme, a grainy yet undeniably endearing image of a fluffy ginger cat wearing a ridiculously tiny, perfectly knitted blue hat. The cat's expression was one of profound, almost existential boredom. For a split second, silence. Ambassador Exila paused mid-sentence, his multiple sensory organs swiveling towards the unexpected projection. His guards stiffened. Then a small snort escaped from one of the Terran security personnel. It was followed by a choked gasp of laughter from a low-ranking aide, quickly muffled. But the damage was done. The image of the supremely serious Xylosian ambassador, mid-lecture on galactic hierarchy, standing just meters from a giant bored cat in a tiny hat, was simply too much for the already strained human delegation. Chairman Sharma's shoulders began to shake. Ambassador Reese's perfectly composed face crumbled into a desperate attempt to suppress a giggle, his eyes watering. General Thorne let out a loud, booming guffaw, unable to contain himself, slapping his knee in open amusement. The entire Terran delegation erupted into uncontrollable laughter. It wasn't malicious, not precisely. It was a visceral, spontaneous outpouring of human absurdity in the face of overwhelming alien pomposity. They laughed until tears streamed. Down their faces, some leaning on each other for support, others simply doubling over. Ambassador Exila stood frozen, his multi-limbed form rigid. His complex sensory organs whirred, processing the unprecedented auditory input. He had no protocol. For this, no known diplomatic response. The human's reaction was illogical, unpredictable, and utterly baffling. He repeated his last sentence, a clipped, confused query about cultural integration benefits, but it was drowned out by the continued peals of human laughter. His internal system struggled to categorize this behavior. Was it a mating ritual? A declaration of war in a bizarre barbarian tongue, a sign of profound mental instability? He scanned the humans, searching for any discernible pattern, but found only overwhelming, joyful cacophony. Finally, with a stiff, almost pained movement, Ambassador Exila turned to his guards. His voice, now laced with what sounded remarkably like confusion and a hint of deep offense, crackled through the translator. This is a display of barbarian disrespect. Unacceptable. We will re-evaluate their primitive communication methods. With that, he spun on his heel and, accompanied by his unblinking guards, marched back through the shimmering portal, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The glory of Xylos Prime began its slow ascent away from Earth, its thrumming sound growing more distant. The Terran delegation, though still wiping tears from their eyes, slowly quieted, the laughter fading into lingering chuckles. A heavy silence settled once more, but this time it was laced not with fear, but with a profound sense of the ridiculous. They had just managed to utterly bewilder the most powerful empire in the galaxy, not with weapons or defiance, but with a well-timed cat meme and a burst of uncontrollable human humor. The true implications of their accidental defiance, however, remained to be seen. The Xylosians were gone for now, but they would undoubtedly return, their confusion replaced perhaps by something far more dangerous. The suspense was no longer just about conquest. It was about how a galaxy-spanning empire would react to a species that couldn't stop laughing at them. The immediate aftermath of the diplomatic incident was a strange blend of relief and mounting apprehension on Earth. The Xylosian vessel, the glory of Xylos Prime, had indeed departed, its thrumming presence fading from the Sol System's sensors. Yet the memory of Ambassador Exilar's utterly bewildered and offended expression lingered, a silent promise of future consequences. The United Terran Council, despite their shared, almost involuntary laughter, understood that they had, perhaps, inadvertently provoked a galaxy-spanning empire. There was a brief, tense period of waiting, a collective holding of breath across human space. Would the empire unleash its full military might? Would they simply ignore humanity, deeming them too primitive or chaotic to bother with? Neither proved to be the case. Instead, a few weeks later, a new, far larger Imperial inspection fleet entered the Sol system. This was not a single diplomatic ship, but a formidable armada. The lead vessel, the Iron Hand of Xylos, was a stark contrast to the ornate glory of Xylos Prime. Its design was purely functional, menacing, and clearly built for long-term presence. Its dark, angular hull seemed to absorb the light, and its sheer mass dwarfed anything humanity had ever constructed. The Iron Hand was surrounded by dozens of smaller, but still immense support cruisers and hundreds of sleek, silent patrol craft. Their purpose was clear: to assess humanity's technological level, cultural development, and resource potential for seamless absorption into the Empire. It was a cold, clinical approach, devoid of the previous diplomatic pomp. The Xylosians, it seemed, had decided that humanity's barbarian disrespect was not a deliberate insult, but rather a symptom of their underdeveloped state, a lack of proper understanding of galactic etiquette. They believed a thorough, systematic imperial inspection would reveal the underlying logic of human society, allowing them to formulate a proper integration strategy. They truly believed in their orderly integration and thought humanity simply needed to be properly categorized. Inspection teams were deployed from the Iron Hand of Xylos and its accompanying vessels. These teams, composed of multi-limbed Xylosian specialists in various fields, xenotechnology, xenopsychology, resource management, and social engineering, descended upon Earth and several other key human-settled planets. Each team was accompanied by silent, heavily armed Xylosian enforcers, their presence a constant reminder of the power backing the inspection. The Xylosians were methodical, disciplined, and utterly humorless. They followed strict imperial protocols, their movements precise, their data collection exhaustive. They expected to find a typical nascent civilization, perhaps a little unruly, but ultimately understandable and ready for imperial guidance. What they found, however, utterly defied their logical frameworks. On Earth, the xenotechnology specialists, with their advanced scanners and analytical tools, began their work. They expected to find rudimentary energy sources and inefficient computing. Instead, they discovered quantum computing arrays that processed information at speeds that bordered on the theoretical for Xylosian science, but which humans were using to optimize everything from interstellar cargo manifests to Bafflingly, pizza delivery routes across entire continents. A Delosian tech analyst, Specialist Cathar, spent an entire cycle trying to understand the pizza optimization algorithm, his multiple processes whirring in confusion, unable to reconcile the complexity of the math with the apparent triviality of its application. The inspection teams moved through human cities, which were a chaotic kaleidoscope of architectural styles, cultural influences, and unexpected artistic expressions. They encountered interstellar cargo ships, vast vessels designed for moving goods between star systems, emblazoned with funky, alien-inspired murals on their hulls, depicting creatures that looked suspiciously like exaggerated versions of Xylosian dignitaries, complete with tiny hats. A Xylosian cultural observer, Drone Unit 734B, meticulously logged these anomalous decorative patterns, its internal database flagging them as unclassified symbolic aggression. Even more perplexing were human military installations. Xylosian strategists, who prided themselves on their logical and efficient combat doctrines, observed human combat simulations. They expected intricate tactical displays, grim-faced soldiers, and ruthless efficiency. Instead, they witnessed digital avatars engaging in highly advanced virtual combat, but with a critical, baffling difference. The human operators had incorporated customizable, ridiculous hats for their virtual soldiers. A highly decorated Xylosian war games analyst, Commander Zilor, observed a simulated tank battle where every tank crewman was sporting a glowing, oversized cowboy hat. He logged it as unfathomable psychological warfare tactics. His report included a specific note: human combatants appear to derive an illogical advantage from visual absurdity. The xenopsychology teams fared no better. They attempted to administer standard imperial psychological assessments, which relied on logical problem-solving and predictable emotional responses. Humans, however, displayed a baffling array of emotional nuances, often shifting from profound sadness to spontaneous joy, from deep focus to sudden distraction, all within moments. They communicated not just with words, but with a myriad of facial expressions, body language, and sounds that seemed to convey layers of meaning entirely alien to Xylosian interpretation. A Xylosian psychologist, designated as Mind Probe Unit, and 9 attempted to analyze human humor, a phenomenon that seemed to accompany many of their most perplexing behaviors. It observed humans engaging in what they called stand-up comedy, where one human would speak into a device, eliciting loud, uncontrolled vocalizations and body contortions from other humans. The psychologist's report concluded, human humor appears to be a complex form of self-inflicted cognitive dissonance, potentially a coping mechanism for underlying societal instability. Further study required, but highly inefficient. Every discovery, intended to categorize human society and prepare it for orderly integration, only served to deepen the Xylosians' profound confusion and growing sense of utter bewilderment. They catalogued human art that seemed to defy all known aesthetic principles, music that shifted from soothing melodies to jarring cacophony, and social rituals that involved elaborate costumes and strange rhythmic movements. The concept of free time was particularly baffling. Why would a species, when not working, engage in activities that had no discernible, productive output, like kicking a ball around a field or staring at moving images on a screen for hours? Reports began to flow back to the iron hand of Xylos, each one a litany of anomalies, unclassified variables, and unpredictable behavior patterns. The Xylosian officers, accustomed to a universe of logical progressions and predictable species, found their analytical circuits straining under the sheer weight of human illogicality. They were not encountering a primitive species, but something Far more unsettling, a species that simply refused to fit into any of their established categories. The Xylosians, for the first time in their long history of galactic expansion, felt a cold dread creeping into their circuits. This wasn't just resistance, this was chaos, cloaked in a perplexing, often amusing disguise. The suspense was building, not from an imminent threat, but from the realization that the Xylosian Empire, in its rigid adherence to logic, was fundamentally unprepared for the delightful, infuriating, and utterly baffling enigma that was humanity. The inspection continued, but with every passing hour, the Xylosian confidence in their ability to integrate humanity dwindled, replaced by a growing sense of the truly unknown. What would an empire built on order do when faced with a species that thrived on glorious, beautiful chaos? The data streamed back to the iron hand of Xylos, each report a fresh testament to humanity's baffling illogicality. Imperial inspectors, trained in the Empire's millennia of rigid scientific and cultural analysis, grappled with information that defied every known principle of their vast civilization. They were attempting to apply their flawless Xylosian logical frameworks to human behavior, and the results were not just inconclusive, they were disastrously comical from a human perspective, though deeply alarming to the Xylosians. For instance, the xenopsychology teams, determined to understand human humor, a phenomenon flagged as a significant obstacle to orderly integration, found themselves spiraling into a profound existential crisis. They meticulously documented instances of what humans called irony, a form of communication where words meant the opposite of their literal translation. Xylosian analysts, whose language was entirely literal, interpreted this as a highly sophisticated, coded form of rebellion, a subversive defiance embedded in everyday conversation. A human saying, "Oh, brilliant, it's raining again," during a downpour was logged as a sarcastic dismissal of imperial meteorological reports. This misinterpretation led to a series of urgent internal debates on the severity of human insubordination. Their attempts to analyze human self-deprecating humor were even more catastrophic. The Xylosians, who prided themselves on their absolute self-confidence and efficient self-assessment, viewed humans making jokes about their own flaws or mistakes as a sign of deep psychological distress, bordering on mental instability. They produced extensive reports detailing the alarming prevalence of self-punishing narratives and recommended immediate psychological restructuring for the entire human population. One Xylosian behavioral specialist spent 3 days trying to cure a human comedian who kept making jokes about his own clumsiness, convinced he was witnessing a desperate cry for help. The Imperial teams also grappled with human pranks, which they classified as complex, ritualistic warfare. A group of Xylosian resource assessors investigating a human agricultural facility fell victim to a well-orchestrated water balloon ambush by a group of laughing human teenagers. The Xylosians, their chitinous forms momentarily drenched, immediately classified the incident as a low-intensity bioliquid attack and generated a tactical assessment outlining the humans' apparent affinity for unexpected, non-lethal projectile weapons. They spent hours analyzing the tactical intent behind the attack, failing to grasp the simple concept of childish mischief. The Xylosian concept of entertainment was a particularly difficult hurdle. Their own entertainment consisted of highly structured educational simulations or meticulously choreographed, logical ballets designed to teach imperial history and values. A Xylosian officer, Commander Arthal, tasked with understanding human media, inadvertently activated a particularly bizarre human comedy sketch from the early 21st century. The sketch involved a man dressed as a giant banana, meticulously slipping on a single banana peel, then getting up, looking confused and slipping again, repeatedly, to the sound of canned laughter. Commander Rathal, a decorated veteran of countless logical campaigns, watched the loop repeatedly, his multiple sensory organs whirring in distress. His internal logic circuits, accustomed only to logical structured data, experienced what could only be described as a system-wide mental overload. The sheer, inexplicable randomness of the sketch, the complete lack of discernible purpose or educational value, left him utterly broken. His report consisted of a single, looping phrase: data integrity compromised. Irreducible absurdity detected. Reports flowing back to Xylos Prime grew increasingly frantic and contradictory. Xylosian analysts struggled to synthesize the incoming data into anything coherent. They noted unclassifiable behavior patterns in human social interactions where individuals would engage in prolonged periods of apparently unproductive conversation, often accompanied by gestures of inexplicable camaraderie. They observed unpredictable emotional outbursts that bore no logical correlation to external stimuli, such as humans spontaneously bursting into song or dance for no apparent reason. And most alarming of all, they recorded a disturbing lack of logical progression in all societal structures, where human decisions seem to be based more on subjective whims or collective sentiment than on cold, hard data. Their urban planning was haphazard, their legal systems full of exceptions, and their economic models seemed to thrive on irrational consumer behavior. The Xylosian Empire, once so confident in its universal logic, found itself facing an enemy, not of overwhelming military might, but of bewildering, joyful chaos. The information gathered did not fit into any of their established categories of primitive, developing, or threatening. Humans were simply different, and that difference, more than any weapon, was causing a deep, cold dread to creep into the disciplined circuits of the Empire. The Xylosians were accustomed to conquering or assimilating, but how could one conquer something that defied all categorization? The suspense was not in the impending battle, but in the slow, terrifying realization by the Empire that this species, with its ridiculous hats and its absurd humor, might be fundamentally unconquerable, not through force, but through sheer, unadulterated human illogicality. They still believed they could eventually understand and control humanity, but every new piece of data pushed them closer to an uncomfortable truth. Some things, some species, simply couldn't be understood by the cold, hard logic of the glorious Xylosian Empire, and that in itself was a terrifying prospect. Back on Xylos Prime, the heart of the glorious Xylosian Empire, the atmosphere in the Imperial High Command Chamber was thick with a tension rarely seen in millennia. Grand Strategist Zikor, whose multiple sensory organs, usually rotated with calm, calculated precision, now quivered almost imperceptibly. His subordinates, usually models of rigid efficiency, stood with a subtle stiffness that betrayed their unease. The endless stream of reports from the Sol system, originally intended to facilitate a smooth integration, had instead sown a profound disquiet. The data, compiled from the Imperial Inspection Fleet's meticulous observations, painted a picture, not of a nascent, easily categorizable species, but of a sprawling, self-contradictory enigma. The Xylosians had expected to find basic technologies that could be upgraded, a simple social structure ready for imperial hierarchy and predictable resource pools to exploit. What they had received, however, was a torrent of anomalies. The first few reports had been dismissed as statistical outliers, perhaps glitches in translation or observational errors. But as the volume of unclassifiable variables grew, as the iron hand of Xylos continued to transmit data on human illogicalities, A chilling realization began to dawn on the High Command. Human technology, while often crude by imperial standards, possessed a terrifyingly efficient adaptability. Their quantum computing, while used for trivialities like pizza optimization, was undeniably powerful. Their energy solutions, though, sometimes cobbled together with what seemed like reckless abandon, were surprisingly robust and often developed with astonishing speed. Xylosian engineers, used to long, methodical research cycles, were bewildered by humanity's knack for jury-rigging complex systems or repurposing discarded technology for entirely new, often unexpected functions. They saw examples of a seemingly obsolete atmospheric processor being quickly converted into a high-capacity water recycler, or ancient, barely functional comms arrays being tweaked to receive signals from previously unreachable deep space probes. This ability to invent on the fly, to creatively solve problems with whatever was at hand, was alien to the Xylosian mindset, which relied on pre-approved designs and established protocols. The social structures were an even greater source of alarm. The Xylosians, accustomed to a clear top-down hierarchy where every individual had a defined role, found human society bafflingly complex and often contradictory. Their political systems, a blend of democracies and various forms of governance, seemed inefficient, prone to internal squabbles, and yet somehow capable of unified action when faced with an external threat. Their economic models, driven by irrational consumer desires and volatile markets, should, by all Xylosian logic, have collapsed centuries ago. Yet they thrived. Most perplexing was humanity's unparalleled ability to cooperate when faced with a common goal, even amidst their internal squabbles. The Xylosians had observed this during the rapid terraforming of distant colonies, where disparate human factions, often at odds politically, would come together with astounding efficiency to achieve a shared objective, or even more bizarrely, how they would rally around a particularly good joke or a viral challenge, dedicating immense collective energy to seemingly pointless endeavors. This capacity for both internal chaos and sudden powerful unity defied Xylosian strategic models entirely. Grand strategist Z-Core activated the primary holographic display, reviewing the collective findings. Images of humans laughing uncontrollably at a Xylosian diplomatic overture, of their ridiculous hats in combat simulations, of their bioliquid attacks, water balloons, all cycled through the air. The Xylosian strategists, accustomed to rigid, predictable foes with clear strengths and weaknesses, found themselves in uncharted territory. How could one predict the actions of a species that seemed to operate on emotional whim as much as logic? How could one counter a defense strategy that involved putting a giant banana costume on a combat drone? Their algorithms for conquest, refined over millennia, simply broke down when applied to humanity. Every attempt to categorize them failed. They were not primitive. Their technology, though uneven, held terrifying potential. They were not warlike in the traditional sense, yet their capacity for stubborn resistance, their sheer unwillingness to conform, was more formidable than any weapon. After a long, agonizing deliberation, one that stretched through several Xylosian cycles of day and night, the Imperial High Command reached a terrifying, unprecedented conclusion. Humanity could not be classified as a species to be simply subjugated or integrated. Their behavior patterns were too unpredictable, their internal logic too alien. Grand strategist Z-Core, with a heavy, almost mournful whir of his internal processes, drafted the official imperial designation. It was a designation that had never been used before, one that sent shivers through the ranks of the disciplined Xylosian Empire. Humanity was to be classified as an unpredictable anomalous variable, high risk of spontaneous unrest. The very concept of not being able to categorize something, of a species that simply refused to fit into their meticulously crafted cosmic order, sent cold dread through the Xylosian logical framework. Their empire was built on order, on predictable outcomes, on the steady march of progress through controlled expansion. Humanity was a rogue element, a wild card, a living embodiment of chaos that could destabilize their entire galactic structure. The suspension of judgment was temporary. They still needed to decide on a course of action. But for now, the glorious Xylosian Empire, rulers of millions of worlds, found itself utterly bewildered and deeply unsettled by a species that seemed to treat their galactic authority as nothing more than a cosmic joke. The suspense was no longer about whether humanity would fight, but about how a galaxy-spanning empire, built on rigid logic and order, would react to the profound existential threat posed by a species that simply refused to conform, and whose primary defense seemed to be a baffling, unconquerable sense of humor. The Xylosians knew with a certainty that chilled their logical core that they had encountered something truly unique and potentially truly dangerous. The classification of humanity as an unpredictable, anomalous variable, high risk of spontaneous unrest, sent ripples of genuine confusion and a quiet, almost existential dread through the Xylosian Empire. Grand strategist Zikor, along with the entire High Command, faced a dilemma unprecedented in their long logical history. Their algorithms for conquest, assimilation, and resource acquisition were useless. How could one conquer a species that treated a diplomatic ultimatum as an unintentional comedy show? How could one integrate a culture whose greatest strength seemed to be its chaotic unpredictability and an infuriating ability to find humor in anything, even its own potential demise? The reports from the Iron Hand of Xylos continued to flood in, each one confirming the baffling nature of the human species. Xylosian military analysts, accustomed to precise combat data, grappled with videos of human soldiers during training, exercises who, after a perfectly executed maneuver, would suddenly break into spontaneous, synchronized dancing. They couldn't decipher if this was a psychological warfare tactic, a morale-boosting ritual, or simply a bizarre form of physical expression. The reports also highlighted humanity's baffling relationship with their technology. While some of their inventions were primitive, they had a terrifying knack for optimizing and repurposing, a skill the Xylosians, with their emphasis on specialized and perfectly designed systems, couldn't replicate. A Xylosian engineer, attempting to reverse engineer a human domestic cleaning drone, inadvertently activated its party mode, causing it to emit flashing lights and loud, rhythmic human music, then spin uncontrollably, cleaning nothing. The My engineer, a being of pure logic, experienced a momentary system overload, unable to comprehend the illogical functionality of the device. The Xylosian Empire had dealt with aggressive species, with cunning species, with defiant species. They had established clear protocols for each, but humanity, with its pervasive, unyielding sense of the absurd, presented no clear threat profile. Their laughter, their jokes, their baffling cultural practices were not weapons in the traditional sense, but they were proving to be an impenetrable shield against Xylosian logic. The idea of launching a full-scale invasion felt ludicrous. How could their perfectly ordered legions fight an enemy that might, mid-battle, decide to engage in a prank war or attempt to befriend Imperial drones with treats? The risk of their disciplined forces being demoralized by sheer, unadulterated human nonsense was too high. They imagined their soldiers, perfectly trained and utterly serious, encountering human combatants who might be wearing ridiculous outfits, or shouting nonsensical challenges, or even trying to engage them in a game of catch. The very thought sent shivers of illogic down the spines of the High Command. Grand Strategist Zakor called for a final critical summit. The holographic table in the chamber displayed all known data on humanity, a swirling maelstrom of contradictions. One Xylosian strategist suggested a deep penetration cultural infiltration, attempting to understand and thus control human humor. Another proposed a vast propaganda campaign to logically explain the benefits of imperial integration. Both ideas were quickly dismissed. The human humor had already broken several Xylosian analysts, and their propaganda, based on cold logic and order, would undoubtedly be met with more laughter and perhaps a new meme involving Xylosian officials. In tiny hats, the empire, built on the unwavering belief in its own superior logic and order, was now confronted with a species that simply refused to fit. They could not compute it, they could not categorize it, and what they could not categorize, they could not control. After what seemed like an eternity of silent contemplation, Grand Strategist Zakor activated the galaxy-wide communication network, overriding all other transmissions. His voice, usually firm and decisive, carried a faint undertone of defeat, though no Xylosian would ever admit such an illogical emotion. The message was concise, clear, and utterly unprecedented in the long history of the glorious Xylosian Empire. It would echo through every system, every imperial colony, every newly integrated world, shaking the very foundations of their galactic dominion. Attention, all imperial assets. Due to unforeseen and unquantifiable variables, the Terran species has been designated as an unapproachable zone of uncategorizable behavior. All imperial vessels are forbidden from interacting with or attempting to integrate said species. Further analysis is ongoing, though results are deemed inconclusive. Imperial forces are to maintain maximum possible distance from the designated Terran systems. This designation is permanent until further notice. The Empire maintains its order. The message ended. The Xylosian fleets in the Sol system, including the formidable Iron Hand of Xylos, executed immediate, precise withdrawal maneuvers. Their sleek, dark forms turned away from the vibrant blue and green of Earth, from the chaotic, illogical humans who inhabited it. They retreated, not due to military defeat, but due to a profound, existential bewilderment. They were defeated, not by plasma cannons or cunning tactics, but by the sheer, overwhelming power of human absurdity. The greatest, most orderly empire in the galaxy had encountered a species it simply couldn't understand, let alone conquer. On Earth, watching the Imperial ships disappear over the horizon, a hush fell over the United Terran Council. Then Chairman Anya Sharma slowly, cautiously, allowed herself a small, relieved smile. Ambassador Kalen Reese chuckled, a genuine, joyful sound. General Valerius Thorn let out a hearty, booming laugh that filled the room. Soon, the entire council chamber erupted, followed by cities, continents, and eventually the entire human civilization. A collective, joyous, and utterly uncontainable roar of laughter echoed across their systems, a sound that carried across the vastness of space, a testament to their unconquerable spirit of absurdity. Humanity, with its love for the ridiculous, its illogical resilience, and its baffling ability to laugh in the face of overwhelming odds, had somehow managed to defend itself from a galactic empire, not by force of arms, but by simply being themselves. The galaxy had never encountered anything like them, and the Xylosian Empire, for the very first time in its long, logical history, admitted defeat. Not by a crushing military blow, but by the sheer, overwhelming, glorious power of human humor. The suspense had ended, not with a bang, but with a galaxy-shaking guffaw, leaving the Xylosians scratching their multi-limbed heads, forever baffled by the species that couldn't stop laughing.